All right, brilliant. Um, Thank you so much for joining us for today's Creating Safer Space Research Cafe. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katja, and I'm the Academic Network Manager of the Creating Safer Space Network. I'm here with Professor Berit Bliesemann de Guevara, who's the Principal Investigator of the network. The aim of our bi-monthly Creating Safer Space Cafe is to enable people in different parts of the world to exchange knowledge and to help build a community of researchers and practitioners who work on unarmed civilian protection, or UCP. In today's Research Cafe, we will be exploring the centrality of relationships to nonviolence and UCP. This will take the format of a roundtable with two researchers whose work focuses on UCP. So Dr. Louise Ridden completed her PhD thesis at Aberystwyth University in Wales in UK in May with the title Making Alternative Worlds, Unarmed Civilian Protection and Nonviolent Imaginaries of Conflict. Felicity is a PhD researcher at the Australian National University, and she's exploring the possibilities and limitations of alternative forms of nonviolent practice that are being used to protect civilians. Felicity is also, I believe, the Global Head of Policy and Advocacy for our partner organization, Nonviolent Peace Force, and also has experience of working as a UCP practitioner in South Sudan. We are delighted that you are both able to join us today to speak about your research. So the format of today's session will be as a roundtable. I will begin by asking our presenters a few opening questions, and then I will hand it over to everyone else to ask any other questions that you might have. So Felicity and Louise, could I begin by asking you about how did you come to research UCP? What was it that motivated you to research UCP in the first place? Louise, perhaps I can start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Katja, and thanks everyone for coming. So for me, I've always had a kind of research interest in the protection of civilians, particularly in areas of armed conflict. And I think for me, studying international relations and IR and international politics, it always kind of struck me that the protection of civilians and research into that and having better understandings of how to keep people safe was really kind of the point of IR. That's how I always kind of understood the discipline. That's always how it really made sense to me. And my master's research looked at UN Security Council resolutions, and particularly the kind of action words and the language around intervention and peacekeeping from the Security Council. So I've always been quite interested in not only the protection of civilians, but for me, and was kind of shown in my PhD research in the end, was kind of imaginations and narrations of protection as well, how protection is kind of promised and narrated and what we do with that. And then UCP as a kind of non-violent method of protection seemed to offer something really different as well. So kind of a new route for that research interest, I guess.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Felicity, what about you? What motivated you to research UCP?
It was a bit of a winding path for me. In my early 20s, I worked for many years as a foreign affairs and defense advisor in Australian politics. I was working for the Australian Green Party, and the Green Party globally, as well as in Australia, have peace and nonviolence as one of the key pillars of their party platform. And so I was always kind of trying to think, like, what does a nonviolent foreign policy look like? What does a nonviolent defense policy look like? And it's not the easiest thing to articulate those alternatives. And so one of the curiosities that I had coming out of that position was, what does this look like in practice? And so after I burnt myself out over 2 election cycles, I escaped to a PhD program, and for about 9 months I really kind of struggled with what what to research, what to write on. And eventually I was like, oh, this is the puzzle that really interests me and that I'm pretty uniquely placed to understand. And so when I was looking at, what nonviolent responses can look like in practice to extreme violence, unarmed civilian protection was one of the key practical examples that kept coming up. And so it was through that pathway that I got in contact with Nonviolent Peace Force. I was invited to one of the regional workshops that NP have been working on as part of their community of practice process. That's where I met Berit and many of the people that I still work with today. And, the rest is history, as they say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. For my next question, could I ask, how did your research evolve and did it change at all in the course of or over time? Perhaps starting with Felicity.
Thanks, Katja. Yeah, mine definitely changed. I think both Louise and Berit as well were kind of interpretivist researchers. And so you almost don't want to go in with a predetermined idea of what you think an explanation for something would be. So in my case, once I arrived at my topic, I knew that I wanted to understand, how does unarmed civilian protection work? That's kind of the overarching umbrella question that my thesis investigates. And although I had that broad question and that framework, I was pretty open to what the answer could be. And I wanted to explore what the possibilities were for different answers from different communities. So the first stage or phase of my research was more of a multi-sided ethnography, where I was in Myanmar, in the US, in Europe, exploring with different UCP practitioners and communities what it was about their work that gave it protective power. That was where the idea of relationship started coming up, and I continued to follow that thread as part of a more traditionally conceived ethnography in South Sudan, which is where I spent more time, did a deeper dive with the same field sites, and tried to understand more specifically how it was practiced in that context. So I don't know if this is Louise's experience, but for me, my research project certainly feels like it has a bit of a life of its own, and I'm just there to kind of present it and speak to what it revealed about itself, rather than me having had an idea and kind of following it through in some very predetermined process. I'm curious to hear what Louise's answer is to this.
Yeah, what about you, Louise?
I definitely agree that the research had a life of its own, and I found that every time I tried to impose a kind of rigid structure, I was already too late. It already kind of moved on without me somehow. So my original research question was the possibilities and limits of upscaling UCP. So it was quite a kind of traditional, kind of rigid, I guess, question of how do we do this? We have possibilities and we have limits. But it changed quite a lot by the end, and partly through my research interests and the project developing, but also circumstance for me. I started the PhD in October 2019. So quite quickly, COVID had a really big impact on fieldwork that I was able to do and how I could contact people. And also the work that UCP was doing and happening changed a lot during COVID too. So that really gave me a chance to step back from this initial question and think, okay, what is it that I'm actually trying to get hold of here? Because I knew that the upscaling question never really felt like something that I was in a position to answer. I'm not a practitioner. I don't practice UCP myself. And I quite quickly became uncomfortable with the idea that I would be kind of prescribing ways to practitioners of how to do their work. So COVID in some ways was difficult. I couldn't travel to do fieldwork, but it also gave me the space to really think what it was about UCP that I found so interesting. And for me, I kept coming back to this idea of nonviolence, actually, rather than necessarily the practice of UCP. itself, it was the idea that UCP was non-violent, particularly in areas of armed conflict, that to me seemed really kind of radical and powerful and different, and to be challenging so many ideas we have. And then I guess I wondered why it was so radical to do something non-violent. Like, surely you kind of would have a bit of both, but it was so radical and it didn't really fit with any of the frameworks that I was finding or what we'd expect to happen. So then my project really moved in the direction of trying to study and understand non-violence in armed conflict. And so I think this is probably the one difference between mine and Felicity's projects, which are pretty similar, is that for me, what's at the centre of my work is non-violence, and UCP is this kind of very powerful manifestation and practice of non-violence, rather than unarmed civilian protection being right at the centre. So yeah, I kind of evolved to then start thinking about what non-violence is, especially when it's practiced. And I was really trying to understand non-violence not only as something that people do, but as a way of kind of knowing and doing and being in the world, this quite big kind of fundamental difference. I found it to me. So it shifted quite a lot from this very kind of practical question to be one where I suddenly found that I didn't understand anything that I thought I understood. It raised some quite big questions for me, I think.
Maybe before we move on, I can also add about COVID, because I had just finished up my field work as a full-time PhD student in December 2019, and so the plan was to go back and to write it up and to be completed kind of in that following year, and then similar to Louise, obviously COVID. And I found being stuck in Australia, where we had very strict border regulations, it felt very strange for me, having spent so much time with teams in the field. And so that is when I ended up reaching out to our team in South Sudan, and when I formally began working for Nonviolent Peace Force. And I think the fact that I was a practitioner through all of the time that I first in South Sudan and then in Ukraine, the influence of that practice lens is very evident in the final product, where, much like Louise is saying, where nonviolence and that thinking is at the forefront of hers, and UCP is perhaps an example of how that occurs. We were talking the other day about how for mine it's almost flipped. The practice and the practicalities and the tensions that this has in the field is very much front and center in mine, and then how nonviolence fits and the theory and the thinking behind that takes more of a backseat. So I think it's interesting. Louise and I were discussing last week how there are some very kind of key threads that run through both of our thesis. The role that relationships play is quite central to both of ours. The role of relationships with time and space, and how that changes when you're using a non-violent ethos or lens, came through in both of our dissertations. And so they're quite complementary in that sense, because they offer something a little bit different, but they have these common threads that can be in conversation with one another.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Could I ask, as the third question, you've already touched upon this a little bit, but did anything in your that you found in your research surprise or challenge you? Maybe Louise, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah, I think almost everything that is in my dissertation is something that surprised or challenged me, honestly. I think I went into the thesis with quite a rigid way of thinking, honestly. So when I was thinking, okay, this is something that happens in peace and conflict studies. How do we make sense of this? We make sense of it through ideas of security and ideas of the state. The state is ultimately the actor that we need to think about. And quite quickly, I realized that was just something I was imposing onto other people. When I'd ask people, how do you think about security? Either they honestly didn't really think about security or themselves as security actors, or they were really trying to kind of stuff their experiences into this box that I'd given them. So instead, I just kind of started saying, tell me about it, you tell me kind of what I need to be thinking about. And like Felicity said, these kind of ideas of kind of embodiment and space and times and how people think of these things and relate to them and imagine them became really, really central to my thesis in a way that I definitely hadn't anticipated when I'd gone in. So I think that was definitely the big surprise. And the biggest challenge, I think, for me, and I thought about this a lot when I was writing up the thesis and when I was preparing to defend it, was what I found in my thesis was that a lot of what I was saying was quite messy, actually. And someone once kind of gave me feedback that they felt like it was maybe nailing jelly to a wall a little bit, the argument that I was making. And I don't necessarily think that that's wrong. That is what I was trying to do. But what I found was, I think there's a lot of kind of nuance and complications and contradictions even sometimes. There's a lot of tension that happens when people are trying to practice non-violence, particularly in areas of extreme violence and violent conflict. And I think in academia, there's often a lot of pressure to have this kind of very neat, singular argument that you can present, and you kind of have your lit review and you have your argument and you're finished. But I really wanted to kind of keep hold of the complexity and the messiness, because to me that was the point of it. It was people's kind of experiences and experiential knowledges and how they feel and think and act in kind of armed conflict through nonviolence was really kind of at the centre of my thesis. And I think it's a real challenge to try and keep hold of that in the final draft. It's so much easier, I think, to write that out. And I tried to keep as much of that in as I could, but that was definitely the biggest challenge for me, to have something that kind of ticked the boxes of what a thesis needs to be, but also that felt honest to what I'd found in the process of research and writing as well, I think.
Brilliant. What about you, Felicity? Did anything you find in your research surprise or challenge you?
I mean, a lot of what Louise just said resonates with me. Definitely, you know, I think anyone who has practiced UCP or who has spent time with teams in the field or communities working on interruption of violence knows that, as Louise said, there is no singular narrative to how violence occurs and to how it's responded to. And so there is this contradiction between what's happening in practice on the ground, both in terms of violence and responses to violence, and then this expectation that you package it neatly into an academic narrative with an overarching theory, and to try and find a way of communicating that in a way that can accommodate that complexity is really, really hard. That's why I really I appreciated a lot of in the end, as I said, mine's a very practice forward thesis, but the underlying theoretical lens is that of relationality. So the idea that we are all connected through relationship, not just with each other, but also with land, with time, with political structures, and that it's through relationship that with those things and between one another that we fundamentally change. And so when you're enacting nonviolence, the goal is that you're changing these structures and these relations to more nonviolent relationships. And then I think one of the biggest challenges was that obviously Sarah Ahmed talks about this, and I quote her in my thesis, where by writing about that violence, and especially as a white woman from the global north, when you're recounting those stories that are not necessarily your own, you also do risk committing acts of almost intellectual violence yourself in how you recount that. And so keeping a check on myself, making sure that the way I was presenting people's stories centered them, centered their agency, which is what UCP also aims to do. You know, that for me was a standard I really kept in mind a lot, and that I hope that I achieved through my thesis, but certainly a challenge in the production of this kind of research when you're from a position of privilege, as I am, is trying to capture people's stories in a way that is honest, that centers them, that centers their expertise, and that I guess gives due respect to this work that they're doing day in, day out, and not just using it kind of in service of an argument and in service of, you know, getting a PhD. So that balance, the expectations of the academy versus what I felt like I owed my UCP community ethically, it's a challenge with this kind of work.
Brilliant. Louise, did you want to add anything to that on the centrality of relationships to nonviolence in UCP?
Yeah, just to say, I think it's quite interesting that Felicity and I came, as we keep saying, it's a very similar topic, but we do come at it from the complete opposite sides. I guess I'm kind of going in with theory, and then I have UCP to work through my theory and my examples, as opposed to kind of doing it the other way around. And I think, yeah, it's quite interesting that we both actually, in the end, though, do use very similar theory. We both draw on relationality. And I think it's kind of quite nice, and for me at least was quite reassuring to, once you get so far into the PhD, you sometimes think, does this make sense, or am I just kind of in so far with this now? And I think it's quite interesting that we've come at a pretty similar problem from quite different ways, but we're still finding this kind of same narrative around relationships between people and communities, and particularly between kind of people and their spaces and their places that are theirs, but they're also shared, and the kind of the times and the way that we narrate things like time and space in people's bodies, and the way that we narrate things like violence and non-violence, I think is really interesting as well. And I think we both had, I've been reading Felicity's thesis this morning, although I'm not that far through, unfortunately. But I think we land quite similarly as well on realizing that non-violence, through this kind of its relational nature, really starts to break down these binaries that we have between things like war and peace and protector and protected. And actually these binaries are something that, again, we often feel the need to impose for clarity, for this analytical clarity, but actually what you kind of gain in clarity, you lose in nuance and complexity of people's stories and praxis as well.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. I would now like to open up the wider discussion. Before I do, I will finish the recording. Just a sec.